Well, thank you for joining us. We have a lot to cover in just 30 minutes. So should we get started, Anna?
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you guys for being here. Tonight we are going to tell you about the 50% law audit results. We did a webinar a while ago prior to the audit coming out, just explaining kind of what the 50% law was and facts perspective on it. So we're excited to follow it up with data from the state auditor. So Wendy, take us away.
So we should introduce ourselves. I'm
Oh,
Wendy
that
Burl
might be
Weinkoop.
important. That might be important.
I'm Wendy Burl Weinkoop. I'm the current president of FAC. I have about 6 weeks left, and then I will no longer be president of FAC. I'll be past president, but I'm glad to be here with you tonight. And I'll pass it off to Anna to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Matthews, Government Relations Director at FAC, and yeah, really excited to be here with you tonight.
So we're going to cover a little bit of basics, but we do have a webinar where we did a deep dive into the 50% law, and I'll throw those slides in the chat in a minute. So if you're interested in knowing more about the 50% law, we're happy to direct you to those resources. But the 50% law was established back in 1961. It actually covers K-12 and community colleges. And the reason for the 50% law was to ensure that 50% of a district's unrestricted general fund budget, so I'm going to be very clear in saying that it's the unrestricted general fund budget, is spent on instructional costs. So our districts get a lot of money from a lot of different places, but this is just the unrestricted general fund. So that does not include counselors and librarian salaries, even though they are faculty. They're not in the classroom, so those two salaries are excluded. But the reason that the law existed is really to focus the district's budget on our primary goal of instruction. So it created a limit in class sizes by default, and also made sure that we were focusing on student success. It made sure that we had, at least of the resources we had, that a sufficient amount of those district resources were going directly to the classroom, and again, our primary goal. Now, as I said before, categorical funds, restricted funds, special grants, local money, federal money, all of those other sources, and you can look at your district's budget and you can see that those aren't all part of the 50% law. So they are completely exempt from the law. So if we look at all the money statewide that a district gets, we should really call it the 37% law, because that's what we spend, 37 cents on the dollar on instruction in the state of California and the community colleges. So what happens if we don't have it? Well, we'd certainly have increased class sizes. If you look at the CSUs and UCs, they have 300 plus person lectures. We definitely have that class size swell. We'd have deprioritization of classroom instruction. And of course, we acknowledge that there's many things that we do to keep a student successful and help them be successful. So it's not that we don't want to spend money on those things. We just know that there's money specifically earmarked from categorical and restricted funds specifically for those things. So our argument would be that we'd have less time per student, we'd have less engagement, we'd have overall decline of educational quality, a widening gap for our students who are disadvantaged or traditionally marginalized students. So we would be undermining the goal of focusing on specifically on education for the California community colleges if we didn't have the 50% law. So back in 1961, the law was established. You can see there was a couple of attempts in 2007 and 2013 to modify the law. We have been talking about this law for as long as I can remember. I'm hitting 30 years in the system. And there's been several times where we've tried to pull in counselor and librarian salaries into the 50% law, what they call the right side of the law. And FAC generally agrees with that idea. However, we would like it to be the 55% law. If you're going to pull in counselors and librarians, which would give the district a lot more flexibility, we want to make sure that we're not spending less money on instruction. We actually, in knowing that this argument was coming again about every 10 years, it pops up. And in 2023, we heard from our system partners that the league was looking at trying to amend the law again. So working with CCCI, FAC requested a 50% law audit, which is what we're going to discuss tonight, the findings of the audit. It took almost 2 years to get that audit complete. In the meantime, we did approach Senator Wilk in 2024 and said, hey, let's run that counselor librarian law again, and let's make it the 55% law and see what happens. And again, it was struck down as quickly as it could be by the league, or CCLC is another name for that organization.
To be clear, like our stance from the beginning was that until the audit came down, that we didn't want any substantive changes to be made, but that was the direction that the league was heading, so we just wanted to be a little bit more offensive in our approach. So I think definitely for us, the intent was to wait till we have all the data from the audit, which, as you will see, reflected our original perspective. But yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you, Anna. So the SB 1039, like the other two attempts, did not move forward. It was pulled within a couple days. And again, yes, we're waiting for the audit. So in 2025, just as the audit was landing, and we know this because we have people who had seen drafts of the audit, the league released a report called Modernizing the 50% Law. And we have a long response to that report, and I'll drop it in the chat in just a second. But we have some concerns about the direction of that report, and we released this response to counter some inaccuracies that we identified within the report. And then finally, we got the audit, and we were very pleased. So we're going to cover that today. So the overview of the audit, and Anna's going to go into the findings, but let me just tell you a little bit about it. So the audit evaluated compliance with the 50% law at just 10 sampled community college districts. Now, the JLAC committee does not determine who they want to focus on, and the California State Auditor picks those districts. So we didn't have control over who those districts were. It found from 2012 to 2022 that administrative positions and compensation increased at a faster rate than faculty and staff and student enrollment. So why was this linked all of a sudden to the 50% law? Well, one of our arguments has been that you can't say that we don't have money for students and wraparound services for students if you have skyrocketing administrative positions and salaries. The audit also assessed how the 50% law impacted districts' ability to fund basic need programs for students. Most districts reported a minimal impact, as basic needs are often funded by restricted funds. So those categorical and restricted funds, there's money for those specifically. And one example is lottery money can be spent on basic needs. And who changed the law so that lottery money could be spent on basic needs? That did. We did that in 2020. It was one of the few bills that were successful in 2020 during COVID. So technology expenses is another thing that we often hear. There's so much money that has to be spent on tech. Well, also technology is actually exempt from counting on either side of the law. Technology, if it's new equipment or new technology, does not even factor into the equation. And then finally, the audit identified that there was insufficient oversight and guidance from the chancellor's office, and allowed for several of the districts to report things accurately in several areas. So that is like a quick overview of the audit, and go ahead and go forward. I think we have a slide of these were the districts that were audited. And this is a summary slide that you can see in the audit. There's some really great graphs all the way through the audit. And even though just 10 districts were focused on in the audit, there is data from all the districts. So I highly recommend you go in and download the actual audit. And a lot of the summary tables in the back have a lot of great data, even if your district isn't specifically listed here as one of the districts they looked at for compliance.
Yeah, and this is a foreshadowing of what you're going to see in the future here, but I believe it was 7 out of these 10 districts inaccurately reported their compliance with the 50% law. So there's a lot going on here. The auditor had, we were like, why is this report taking so long to produce? Which, you know, audits do take a long time, but there was definitely a lot here. It's a very comprehensive, well-done report, so definitely take some time and take a look at it. So we're going to jump right into the findings. So some of the things that the auditor covered were what some thoughtful adjustments to the 50% law formula could look like, the difference between the ratios in both amount of positions and salaries for faculty, administration, and support staff, as well as the amount of students that we had enrolled over the last decade or so, and the impact on student success that the 50% law has had. It also looks into the impact on basic needs. It was a big talking point of the league that the 50% law prevented districts from having the flexibility that they needed to be able to spend resources on meeting student basic needs. We at FAC 100% believe that basic needs are a critical part of our students being able to be successful in the classroom, and have supported lots of legislation on student basic needs. But it was cool to see the auditor really dig into, okay, does the 50% law actually make it difficult for districts to meet their students where they're at or not? And as Wendy mentioned, they did find kind of a negligible impact there. And we'll also look into district compliance and the Chancellor's Office's role in that. So starting off with adjusting the formula, the auditor recommended that, the legislature could act to include librarian and counselor salaries in the numerator. This is something that FAC has been a proponent of for quite a while, but also to increase the percentage up from 50% to reflect these additions. I wanted to add a picture of a scale because I do think that this is basic math, right? If we're adding librarian and counselors salaries to one side of the equation, we need to make sure that we're increasing the threshold up from 50%, or else overall we're going to be spending less money on education. And you may have noticed in the timeline slide where we talked about some of the recommendations from the CCLC report, it involved adding technology and librarian, counselor salaries, all sorts of different things, but not increasing the numerator of the formula. That was something that was really important to us, that we keep that balance so we are having adequate amounts of resources being put into classroom instruction. So we appreciated that coming from the auditor. And they said, their verdict sort of on the technology issue is that it should be excluded entirely from the formula. So this was quite the graph that came out of the audit, but it illustrated the statewide 10-year percentage change in FTES. And as you can see, the administrators have had a 45% increase in FTES over the last decade, compared to a 3% increase in faculty, 7% increase in our classified folks, and a negative 9% for students. So obviously this is not very balanced, which is why we struggled, I think, with the argument that the 50% law was preventing districts from having the flexibility that they needed, because clearly there is a lot of money that is being spent on the administrative side, and we'll get into that a little further in a second. But this 45% does not even include administrative positions that were paid for with restricted funding, which some of them are, especially if they're pertaining to categorical program administration and things of that sort. So definitely a bit of a striking graph here. So next we're going to look at the change in average salaries over the last decade, and we've seen that administrative salaries, we have a 116% growth here. So that, I think, is a really striking change. You will notice that these numbers on this side are smaller just because we have a larger portion of faculty and support staff than we do have administrators, but this, I think, also said a lot about kind of the balance and the ways in which, community colleges have used the resources that they've been given lately, and I think underscores the need not for more flexibility in terms of being able to take money out of, resources that are dedicated for instructional purposes and move them elsewhere. So the impact on basic needs. Again, this was a really big talking point, that the 50% law was preventing districts from being able to meet student basic needs. So these are quotes straight from the auditor. The auditor said that most districts reported that spending on basic needs services does not significantly impact or affect district compliance with the 50% law. Most districts indicated that they pay for their basic needs services programs primarily using restricted funds, as Wendy had mentioned prior. And because the 50% law's calculation doesn't include restricted funds, spending on those services does not impact districts' ability to comply with the 50% law. The auditor also noticed that there wasn't really a standard system for tracking basic needs expenses across the districts. So that was reflected in their recommendations, which we'll cover a little bit later. but districts were not really consistently tracking expenses on basic needs, where they're going and all of that sort of thing. So, district compliance. So from fiscal years 2018 through 2022, only 5 of the 73 districts self-reported non-compliance with the 50% law. Most of those are basic aid districts that are community funded, aka they don't receive state apportionment. And because of that, the auditor found that the Chancellor's Office sort of lacked a viable enforcement mechanism to hold these non-compliant districts accountable. So they encouraged that we look for a mechanism to be able to do so. And again, compliance is something that is self-reported by districts to the Chancellor's Office, which there were also some further issues with. There were also bigger picture outside of, the numbers themselves, that districts were able to adjust their financial reporting in order to achieve compliance, such as moving things around to make it easier for them to comply, like moving expenses from the unrestricted general fund, which is subject to the 50% law, to a restricted or categorical funding source, which is not included under the 50% law, and they did things like that to sort of increase their compliance rate. Another thing is that districts can sort of get around hiring more full-time faculty, which FAC was able to secure millions of dollars in funding for districts to hire full-time faculty, and it was found that lots of that funding was not used appropriately and did not really go towards hiring full-time faculty. So lots of districts were kind of increasing faculty salaries to avoid having to hire new faculty in order to still be in compliance with the law. The other thing is, state law prohibits the use of certain lottery funds for non-instructional purposes. Wendy mentioned that FAC did a lot of work to make sure that this money could also be opened up and used for basic needs if it was the case that, more resources was needed to help out with basic needs, and districts were struggling with the 50% law because of the need to support student basic needs, which is certainly there, that they were able to use the lottery funds to do so. However, 2 districts that were reviewed, College of the Redwoods and Mount San Antonio College, it was found that they had used these lottery funds for utility payments and bank fees. This is another thing where we're thinking, okay, so we're opening up different pots of money to make it easier here, and then we're seeing some of them sometimes being misused, which is a difficult thing when you're arguing that you want greater flexibility. So these are some screenshots before I get into the role of the Chancellor's Office in district compliance, but these are some screenshots of headings from the audit itself. They're all pulled straight from there, but I'm just going to read them. The Chancellor's Office inadequate oversight allowed, like I said, 7 of 10 districts that were reviewed to inaccurately report compliance rates. If that was the case for 7 out of 10 districts, and this doesn't mean that they were not in compliance with the 50% law, it just means that the percentage that they reported was not accurate. So if this is the case with 7 out of the 10 districts that were audited, I imagine that there are some serious widespread issues about district self-reporting of their compliance rate with the 50% law. Some of the reasons for that were insufficient training, because there just is not adequate training that is being done currently to make sure that districts know how to code things and make sure that they are reporting correctly. The other thing is, when financial reports are submitted by districts, Chancellor's Office did not review them. So lots of things that were red flags ended up being overlooked. The other thing is, there is a statewide exemption process for colleges that do not want to sort of keep up with the 50% law, if you will, and the Chancellor's Office did not follow that exemption process and didn't really have a mechanism to hold non-compliant districts accountable. Wendy is really excited to talk about Calbright and their non-compliance and the exemption process and a little bit of that. But overall, just limited oversight on the part of the Chancellor's Office and this need for better training, guidance, and oversight in terms of compliance with the 50% law. So some of the things that the auditor said was that, again, insufficient guidance. It needs to be reviewed and updated where necessary in the manual to make sure that errors are correctly identified, that the Chancellor's Office should be reviewing the district's financial reports on their own to make sure that they're seeing, okay, there are some clear areas with misreporting. I believe it was Napa College. In what they had submitted to the chancellor's office, their numerator was larger than their denominator. So some glaring, basic mathematical issues and things like that that the chancellor's office did not catch because they did not review those documents. That they're not also requiring districts that are non-compliant to submit the required compliance plans with the requisite information, as well as the need for regular trainings and clarification of that guidance to make sure there's no gray areas here. So I'm going to hand it back over to Wendy to just reiterate some of the recommended changes that the auditor suggested that the legislature make. So just to be clear, like an audit goes over, okay, this is what's happening, this is the lay of the land, but the audit doesn't have like a binding power in and of itself to say, okay, now that we know what's going on, these changes have to be made. It's only able to recommend that the legislature act and make changes. So these were the proposals that the legislature could act on that the auditor has proposed. So go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Anna. So yeah, we don't know that any of this will actually take effect, although usually the chancellor's office is going to listen because they know legislation will follow after that. So some of the recommended changes, these are legislative changes. So the California State Auditor, who's independent, is saying, hey, legislature, here's some things you might want to consider. So the legislature should consider amending the 50% law to include librarians and counselors' salaries in the numerator. So it's not just throw in the amount of cost of counselors and librarians, but also think about the numerator, right? So that we're adjusting it proportionately. That would mean that instead of the 50% law, it would likely be something like the 55 or 60% law. We'd have to do the math. So consider increasing, right, the percentage of which they have to comply with this law. We agree with that 100%. That was one of the things that we agreed with all along. The legislature should consider amending the 50% law to allow districts to exclude technology expenses. Generally, they're outside the law anyway. There are some that are inside the law, but not a lot. So if you have a new piece of equipment on campus, which technology, you rarely are buying the exact same thing because technology is always changing and becoming new. That is outside of the 50% law. It's not part of the equation at all. There could be districts that don't realize that or know that. And circling back to Anna's recommendations for the chancellor's office, maybe better training is needed on campuses so that campuses are aware of that. Other recommendations that the chancellor's office should update its accounting manual to specify how districts should track spending on basic needs services. The auditors couldn't really figure out exactly what basic needs services were, how they're tracked, how we're monitoring them. Again, Mount SAC said that basic needs were paying the electric bill for the college. So we need to look at what is that exactly when we say basic needs for students, what's allowable, what's not allowable, or how do we track it? If we're going to make a change in the law to say that districts are having trouble paying for basic needs for students and wraparound services, what does that actually mean? Also, creating a recommendation to create an enforcement mechanism that holds non-compliant districts accountable. So basic aid districts, we have 7 or 8 of them, I believe. So what a basic aid district is that they have enough local funds that they don't rely on state apportionment. So the chancellor's office has not enforced the 50% law because they're not quite sure how to enforce it if they don't get state apportionment. So, for example, if a school that is non-basic needs violates the 50% law, then the chancellor's office could take their money away. But if they don't get money from the state, then how do you take money away? So how do you imply some sort of financial penalty? Well, the chancellor's office can't ignore it. We need to think about how we're going to do that as a system. And then also the district should consistently and thoroughly document funding sources used and justifications for adding new administrators and report them to the legislature annually. That's a great one. I highly recommend you just do a search find for that one. That'll make you very happy. One of the things that the audit found is that there really was no consistency between hiring administrators and student success. right? So if you're going to hire administrators and say that our student success relies on all these administrators, then you better be able to link it. So one of the findings is maybe that should be in the job descriptions for the administrators. Yeah, I agree. I think that would be great to see a link to student success. Somebody asked a question about, are counselors and librarians considered administrators? No. Instructional faculty, librarians, and counselors are all faculty. Just counselors and librarians are not instructional faculty, so they're not on quote unquote that right side of the law. Staff are classified staff, and administrators are managers. So the definition of administrator is a manager is not the one that's necessarily doing the work, right? But somebody who's managing those of us who do the work. So you can see the incredible increase of the amount of managers we've had in our system through this audit. And then go ahead and go forward. And so no exceptions, Calbright, no exceptions. This made me also very happy. So Calbright is our 100% online college with a giant budget and few completion ability for students to complete. It has never been in compliance with the 50% law since its inception. And it is, somewhere in the single digits in terms of compliance. Well, the audit says, hey, Chancellor's Office, Calbright cannot be an exception. You can't allow them to just ignore the law. And the Chancellor's Office must immediately require Calbright to follow at least the state exemption process rather than just ignore the law. So they first have to follow the exemption process, and then we can see where they go from there. But that was satisfying to hear that that college could no longer just ignore the law.
Thank you guys for coming tonight.
Thanks, everybody.